Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Alhamdulillah, we are starting online teaching after a long period. Our today's discussion is about most important philosopher Montesquieu. Period of Montesquieu was 1689 to 1755. Montesquieu was a French philosopher. He studied law. He was appointed a counselor to the Bordeaux Parliament. He served as president of the Bordeaux Parliament for 12 years. He visited Austria, Hungary, Venice, Rome, Switzerland, Holland, and England. In England, he spent 2 years. In England, he came to close contact with the leading politicians and was deeply impressed by the English conception of the liberty and also by the political system. In fact, Roman history and English institutions were the chief sources from which Montesquieu derived his inspirations. In his writings, he followed historical and empirical method. Now we examine about his most important writings. Number 1, the Persian letters. Number 2, the Spirit of the Laws, his most famous and most popular book, which he wrote in 1748. Next most important book was about Considerations on the Causes of the Greatness and Decline of the Romans. In his writings, he highlighted his views in a comprehensive way. Due to his major contributions, he is known as the Aristotle of the 18th century. His method was empirical, and in his writings, his most famous book was The Spirit of the Laws. It is very important to discuss here that Montesquieu opens his book, The Spirit of the Laws, with a definition of law. Laws, in their most general signification, are the necessary relations arising from the nature of things. In this sense, all beings have their laws, the deity his laws, the material world its laws, the intelligences superior to man their laws, the beasts their laws, man his laws. Montesquieu is stating his assumption that a natural law governs all things, including men. Now we briefly examine about his emphasis about different types of laws. For example, the positive laws. According to Montesquieu, positive laws are established by man himself. These laws are the particular and precise institutions of legislature. They are not universal. These laws accepted in one community cannot necessarily be applied to the other. Laws are subject to change, growth and development within every community with the changing circumstances. Then he divided positive laws into three main categories. Number one, international law. He was greatly influenced by Hugo Grotius. According to him, international law maintains regulation of relations among states. So, international law closely related to regulate relations among different states. Number two, civil laws. Civil laws determines the relations among citizens. Next, political law, which regulates the relation between individuals and the state or between individuals or government, is called political law by Montesquieu. Now we examine Montesquieu's views about different forms of governments. Number one, Republican. He explains Republican form of government as a body of people possessing supreme power. Then he explains aristocracy, the supreme power possessing in few peoples. And then he explains monarchical form of government in which a single person governs by fixed and established laws. Then he explains despotic form of government. According to him, a single person directs everything by his own will without law and any fixed rule. Montesquieu explains that each form of government is associated with its particular principles. Now examine his views about the influence of physical environment on political and social institutions. Montesquieu gives considerable attention to the impact of the physical environment upon political and social institutions, giving particular importance to climate, soil, occupation, form of government, commerce, religion, customs, etc. He tries to establish the relation of cause and effect between the climate, soil, fertility, natural resources, the topography of the place, and the character and the habit of the people who live in it, and their social and economic ideas, laws, manners, morals, and religious beliefs. He shows the effect of heat, cold, dryness, and moisture on the organs of human body and on the intellect and passions of men. So, this was a great contribution of Montesquieu in the history of political philosophy. His next most important contribution was about the laws and their relations to nature and principles of governments. The laws of a democracy and republican should maintain the equality of the people, especially their equality about economic aspects. He explains and he clarifies that the equal distribution of wealth need not be absolute, but there should be well-defined limits for inequality imposed and maintained by law. And in an aristocracy, moderation is the key to stability, and the laws of honor, and in despotism it is necessary to have a large army, for force is required to maintain peace, because a despotic government is based upon absolute and unlawful basis, and this government also based upon fear. A government should be based upon rule of law, that is best form of government. A government's corruption, Montesquieu says, begins with that of its principles. The superstructure of government rests upon the foundation provided by its appropriate principle. When the foundation is altered, the superstructure must be changed accordingly. Next most important point of this discussion is that Montesquieu gives considerable attention to the impact of physical environment upon political and social institutions. He explained that territory also has significant relationship to the governmental forms. A republic requires a small territory. If republic is too small, it may be conquered by external enemies. Large republics are endangered by internal factions and internal instability. So, Montesquieu resolved this problem by presenting his views about confederation. Montesquieu's solution is the establishment of the confederation. The principle and advantages of confederation is that it permits each unit of government to resolve its own domestic problems without involvement with interference from other units. That consensus with regard to the general interest, at the same time, the constituent units may unite to present common front in matters of military and foreign policy. Montesquieu's ideas concerning the relationship between extent of territory and governmental form were well known and had considerable influence practically with the men who framed the Constitution of the United States of America. Those ideas form an integral part of the theories of federalism found in the series of essays by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, known as the Federalist. So, Montesquieu's this contribution always remained a prominent place in the history of Western political thought. After examining his different views about different aspects of territory, different forms of governments, different laws, now we examine Montesquieu's most important and integral part of his philosophy, that is about liberty and separation of power. The central theme of Montesquieu's theory is his views about liberty and separation of powers. This part of Montesquieu's theory, which is best known and has the greatest influence upon American Constitution, Montesquieu's concern is with the constitutional arrangements necessary in a government to secure liberty of individuals. According to him, liberty could have been possible only where governmental powers were subject to limitations. Montesquieu believed that the best safeguard against tyranny and guarantee of liberty was the separation of power among different organs of the government. According to him, each power must be exercised by a separate organ, and a system of checks and balances should thus be established. During his 2-year stay in England, he was deeply impressed by the freedom which the British people enjoyed. Montesquieu attributed this freedom to the way in which the three functions of government, legislative, executive, and judicial branches had been separated from each other. He came to realize that for the maintenance of liberty, the separation of power was absolutely very necessary. Jude Harman explains Montesquieu's contribution in these words: the only valuable liberty is that which we enjoy under the law. In order to establish and maintain moderate government, power must be checked with power. This is most important point of this discussion. Montesquieu's theory of separation of power exerted a great influence in America. It was applied in both federal and state constitutions and was included in many of the state bills of rights. It was also included in the Declaration of Rights of Man drawn up by the Revolutionary Assembly in France. Montesquieu's different contributions and his comprehensive analysis of different major topics related about the subject of political science are his most important contributions in the history of Western philosophy. After examining different views about different aspects, about different topics, now we conclude topic of Montesquieu. After examining, after discussion Montesquieu's political philosophy, it becomes necessary to evaluate him and to assess his contributions to history of political theory. Montesquieu was not impressed by then existing conditions of France, which were rather disappointing. The internal politics of France was far from political satisfaction. Peoples were governed by despotism under the Louis XIV, and there was unrest in the country. High officials of government and nobles were enjoying a life of luxury. The masses had no liberty, no rights. His writings represent the internal political circumstances of France. Due to these conditions, he supported constitutional monarchy and a government subject to the doctrine of checks and balances. According to George Sabine, a very prominent writer of Western political philosophy, George Sabine wrote about contributions of Montesquieu. Of all French philosophers in the 18th century, other than Rousseau, the most important was Montesquieu. He presents at once the best scientific aspirations of his age and its unavoidable confusions. Montesquieu had bitterly criticized the political, social, and religious institutions of his time. He was depressed by internal politics of France. His writings represents the voice of his age and demand of constitutional monarch and a system of check and balances. So, due to his different contributions, he considered Aristotle of 18th century in the history of Western political thought. And that is the end of our today's discussion of this topic of